I'll start with a question. I think when I talked to people about we're gonna have an internalized racism presentation, some people had some reactions. There's a lot of focus on external hate. Why are we focusing on internalized racism? I wanted to see how would you respond to that? Very briefly, I know there's some questions coming up now. So very briefly, how would you respond?
I would just say, just briefly, the fact that we end up kind of supporting all the other external oppression if we actually have internalized racism ourselves, and other people can point to people who have internalized racism and saying, look, they don't care. And so it kind of supports their perspective. In that sense, it perpetuates it even further. That's why it's so dangerous.
So we have another question from Grace. Any advice on how mental health professionals can bring post-colonial psychology into their clinical work or interventions versus just multicultural counseling skills?
Yeah, just real quick. I'm just going to provide a couple of, I guess, references. I mean, check out liberation psychology. I think there's a lot there. There's been a lot of work that's been done there. And I think that's really powerful. And then specifically, there's a social justice counseling by RATS, RATTS, which and gets more into the specifics of how we can incorporate really a social justice orientation into our clinical work. So check that out.
Okay, so I'll move to the next question that Con raised. What is more nuanced understanding of shame in reference to Dr. Lee's comment? What is a more nuanced understanding of shame?
What I want to say is two things. The fact that often, once again, because we're not given the category of race, we tend to think about shame, once again, as a culture value only, without thinking about all the structural racist dynamics, right? So that's basically what ends up happening. And so we don't realize the fact that shame itself is being orientalized as a way of kind of reducing the Asian American context to a particular value, right? And so it's like a stereotype based in a sense. And in that sense, it's not the fact that shame or collectivists or individual, or saving face is not an issue. It ends up flattening the Asian American experience, and we don't realize the fact that there's a racial structural dimension to how shame is being used. So that's basically one of the things that I really want to highlight.
We have another question by Natasha. She asks, I often hear dismantling the system of racism. When the system is dismantled, what remains, if anything?
I can respond to that. Race is a social construct. Racism being really the way that our society has been defined and organized by race is what racism is, that it defines the value of who a person is. It's not about denying that our phenotypes are different. Yes, when we talk about color of our skin, texture of our hair, these different physical features, that is real, that is a reality. But the problem is when we've started to define the value, an inherent value of a person based on race. So if that gets dismantled, then what that means is that we are no longer organizing our systems of justice. We are no longer thinking about how resources are available to people based on race, and that the people who are making decisions, designing our structures and our systems in our society are not necessarily just one racial group that has historically possessed the power. So when I think about dismantling the system of racism, I think it actually means that we are no longer defining our value and our worth based on race. And so I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime. To be honest, it is a dream, but I'm not sure that in my lifetime we will ever see that system of racism ever fully dismantled.
Thank you, Dr. Unhammer. So we have two more questions. We'll see if we can get through these two before we end. Andrew asked, how does the colonialized mentality differ in Asian Americans as opposed to Asians? For example, in Filipino Americans versus Filipinos, how are these healing journeys distinct?
That is a great question. It might look differently. So the manifestations might look differently. So like, for example, with my research with Filipino Americans, there's a lot of within group discrimination, as I mentioned earlier. People make fun of FOBs, and this is common across different Asian groups as well. People make fun of FOBs. That might not, for example, exist as much or be as much of an issue in the Philippines. Or if it does, it's going to look very different, right? If there is within group discrimination for Filipinos in the Philippines, it might be between Filipinos who are, in the urban, metro Manila area, and them discriminating against those who are from the provinces, those who are, from the non-urban areas. You see what I mean? Or it might be between the Tagalog people who are, the more dominant ethnic group in the Philippines, discriminating against, the other ethnic groups, the other indigenous groups in the Philippines. So it might look very different in that sense. And then the journey, I think that the latter part of that question is how might the journey differ? The journey, we're still learning a lot. The journey is still, I think that the journey is going to vary from person to person, but I think we're still very far from truly understanding what this thing called decolonization is. For one, some folks have already said decolonization is not a metaphor. Decolonization means, give us our land back. That's, if you really, it's real. Right? Decolonization is real. It's more than just a metaphor, right? Decolonization means get out of our land, right? And so there's the land back movement now among many indigenous groups, right? Whereas other folks, they think of decolonization in other ways, like in this case, like mental decolonization or psychological decolonization, right? So again, it varies, and there's different perspectives on what that looks like right now.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. David. I know we have 2 questions, but I'm also aware of time. Yeah, I'll read them out loud. If certain panel want to respond through text, we can do that. But I'm also aware of time. And so one asked, does the process of decolonization adapt with the changing landscape of migration and migration patterns? If so, how? And the other question asks, do you have any suggestions for how to have conversation with Asian American Christian friends who do not endorse the internalized oppression and racism that Asians face, and have the perspective that Asian Americans are fine and doing okay as a group? And one last comment. Hi, Dr. David. Here in the Philippines, one manifestation is the use of English. English has become a powerful tool. You are laughed at with wrong grammars, etc. Also, people use English if one wants to assert himself or herself. And so thank you for the questions. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to get to it, but those are really good questions. And as we wrap up today, I really, again, want to thank Dean Dr. Cosse, your support for this sponsorship of event between the Asian American Center and the School of Psychology and Family Therapy. And I really want to thank Dr. David, Dr. Lee, and Dr. Yu Hammer for presenting such rich information with us today. And I want to give a shout out to Jason Chu for organizing the event, as well as several of our students in SLP MFT.